When my son was born with Down syndrome, an elderly relative started telling me a story. She told it every time she saw me. The story was about her sister who'd been warned by her doctor not to have any more children. It was 1960, and the doctor prescribed the new drug Inovid, which is the first oral contraceptive, the first birth control pill. And this elderly lady's sister asked her priest if this would be okay. And of course the priest said no. Not just because it was contraception, but because the drug was new and it wasn't well studied. The sister chose to follow her spiritual leader and to not follow the new pharmacological religion that was trying to replace it. Now, this elderly relative would look me in the eye and she would say how her sister's doctor expressly told her not to have any more kids, but she went ahead and listened to her priest instead. And then, after a meaningful pause, she would say, "And look what she got." What she was saying was the child with Down syndrome was a punishment. And the reason she kept telling this story is because I had a child with Down syndrome, and she had early Alzheimer's. And she was trying to reconcile something, some little piece of something in her mind. It took me a long time to really hear what she was doing with that. She wasn't being intentionally cruel. She was just doing theology. She was trying to make the suffering make sense, to put it in a framework where unjust things happen for a reason. It's just that in her decidedly allopathic religious view, unjust things don't happen for good reasons. They're punishment. And that's the dominant cultural framework for suffering that seems unjust, suffering that comes to children, to innocent people, that doesn't seem earned or deserved. That framework says someone is to blame. So either God is cruel, or God doesn't exist, or you, or your parents, or your karma, or yourselves did something wrong. Today, I want to offer a different understanding entirely, and it's based on the fifth biological law of the Germanische Heilkunde, what I like to call the law of meaning. Nature makes no mistakes, and your symptoms are no exception. Welcome to Mind Over Symptom, where we uncover the deeper pattern. The title of this episode was originally Why Babies Get Cancer, the Biology of Unjust Suffering. That phrase, unjust suffering, is the atheist's favorite argument against God. And it's also, frankly, an uncomfortable question for anyone who studies the GNM, because if biological conflicts arise from the psyche, does that mean a sick baby has created its own illness? How can we blame a baby for its own suffering? Let's start with the answer that doesn't work, which happens to be the answer that the entire health industry and most of our mechanically deterministic modern civilization believes in. Answer one is, there is no God and suffering is random. That's why the baby suffers. That's why horrible things happen, because the universe is an indifferent machine. Cancer in a baby is meaningless. It's a mutation, a genetic error, it's bad luck. The appropriate response is to fight it with everything medicine has and grieve the unfairness. This answer at least seems honest, right? It takes the suffering seriously. But it leaves us in a universe with no ground under our feet, no meaning, just biology doing what biology does, which is at best random and meaningless, but also sooner or later just rolls over whoever's in the way. Life's a bitch and then you die, ha ha. Now, let's look at the answer that seems to come from GNM, and is probably the main reason people who reject the Germanische Heilkunde hate it so much. Answer two to how we can blame a baby for its own suffering is that the baby created its conflict. Or worse for the poor baby, its parents created its conflict while it was in utero. This is the version that sometimes circulates in alternative health and GNM circles, and it's really upsetting. The idea that a sick child or a sick adult or a person experiencing tragedy has manifested or attracted their suffering through their psyche, through their karma, their vibration. That's victim blaming with either a spiritual vocabulary or a GNM vocabulary. It may have a grain of something true in it, But the way we tend to use this kind of an answer, it's more about the speaker's need for a tidy explanation than about the truth of the person's experience. Neither the "there's no God" answer nor the "blame the victim" answer is adequate. The first makes suffering meaningless, the second makes the victim a perpetrator. And neither one acknowledges that biology follows laws. I'd expect that error from medical practitioners, but when GNM practitioners think that way, they've completely missed the point. Modern medicine and the scientific materialist worldview that underpins it functions in practice as a religion, complete with priests, that's the doctors, sacred texts, that's the controlled acts, legislation, the clinical guidelines, and so on, rituals, that's checkups, screenings, vaccinations, prohibitions, don't take supplements without medical supervision, don't go more than a year without a mammogram, and so on. And a reward system. Good patients get good care, non-compliant patients get discharged or dismissed. It has a creation myth too. The universe is a clockwork machine. Life is an accident of chemistry, and human beings are, at bottom, meat robots with occasionally malfunctioning parts that eventually completely break down at around age 70 to 90 on average. And the universe is completely indifferent. Within this worldview, this religion, suffering is caused by the machine breaking. The appropriate response is to find the broken part and fix it. And if you can't fix it, if a baby gets cancer, for example, then either the machine was flawed from the start or the indifferent universe did something sociopathic to that poor baby, or both. I'm not saying medicine is useless. Conventional medicine can save your life. It genuinely can in the right circumstances. But the metaphysical framework underneath it, the assumption that life is random and suffering is meaningless, that's not medicine. That's a belief system, a dogma, and it does enormous psychological and spiritual harm to anyone that's indoctrinated to it, because it wastes your life on trivia. When you're suffering, the doctrine of conventional medicine and the rest of scientific materialism cuts you off from the possibility of meaning. It cuts you off from the idea that your experience is happening for you or by you rather than to you. And that isolation, that existential isolation, the sense that you're alone in an indifferent universe, is, as we know in Germanische Heilkunde, the seed of every biological conflict. I'm going to come back to that. Humans are born with exactly two innate fears: loud noises and falling. Every other fear is acquired through experience, and that acquisition begins immediately, before birth, in fact. A baby is not a blank slate. A baby is a being on an evolutionary path, arriving with a psyche, a biology, and a family, social, ancestral context. Its phylogenetic history is what all that is. And that began long before that baby took its first breath. A baby's not a passenger. A baby is a participant in an ontogenetic process that is larger than any individual life. The complexity of a child's psychological experience isn't the same as an adult's. That child hasn't been rewriting its psyche based on 2 decades of trying to fit into an external doctrine. But the baby's psyche is as real and as sophisticated as an adult's. In fact, it's more real and sophisticated because its context window, so to speak, hasn't yet been jammed up with conflicting and pointless instructions from medieval medicine and public education theory. So, while the baby's afraid of loud noises and falling, the baby isn't afraid of being judged, or whether it should follow the doctor priest versus the Christian priest, or if its position in the hierarchy is secure, or 99.5% of all the other crap you and I worry about. Now, why in the world would such a wonderful little creature make cancer? As I said earlier, both conventional medicine and GNM tend to wrongly say that the suffering is either meaningless or was attracted in some weird masochistic decision deep within the child's psyche. Biological laws of the Germanische Heilkunde don't say that suffering is punishment. They say suffering is purposeful. And they say that suffering is not coincidental or random. The fifth biological law is both the most important and the least understood biological law of the Germanische Heilkunde. Dr. Hammer discovered this law in 1994, some 13 years after already discovering the first biological law, the iron rule of cancer, and also several decades after practicing dogmatic conventional medicine. But we're a little bit dismissive of it in the GNM community sometimes. We love to zone in on the first biological law and then misinterpret it to be something along the lines of, I was just innocently minding my own business, and then some bad event happened and shocked me, and that made a thing in my psyche, which then gave me cancer. Also, I'd better not solve this thing in my psyche because then I might get healing phase cancer, which might, do me in. Yikes. Now, that's not really what the first biological law says, but that is how we interpret it when we're used to thinking in terms of devoutly atheistic, reductionist medicine. But the fifth biological law sets us completely straight in this regard. The fifth biological law of the GNM says every special biological program, every illness, every symptom is meaningful in the context of that individual's evolution, not in the context of karma, not in the context of divine punishment, in the context of evolution, of becoming a new and better version of themselves. The body isn't breaking. The body's responding intelligently and purposefully to a biological conflict in the psyche. And that biological conflict, and the special biological program that it initiates, exists because the organism is striving to learn, adapt, and especially evolve into a new version of itself. It actually has nothing to do with the events, the genes, the circumstances, the shock, the carcinogens, the stress mom was under when dad didn't do what she wanted during the second trimester. None of that is what creates biological conflict, special biological programs, symptoms, or suffering. It's the intention to evolve that creates all of that. This is true of cancer in an adult, and it is true of cancer in a baby, and every other biological manifestation that arises as part of a special biological program. It doesn't mean the baby deserves it. It doesn't mean the parents did something wrong. It means that this being on its evolutionary path, in the context of its family and history and biology, is going through an ontogenetic process and is at the experimental leading edge of that. Underneath every biological conflict, there's the root conflict. That's the existential isolation conflict. The deep, often unconscious feeling that there is no ground under my feet, that life is not held by anything loving or intelligent, that I am alone in a universe that doesn't care whether I live or die, that the fact I haven't been crushed like a grape due to some random accident yet is merely a stroke of very good luck. This isn't a philosophical position most people consciously hold, but it is what our cultural paradigm teaches us, especially when it comes to the hard life and death stuff that happens in the medical setting. So this deeply unsettling existential meaningless, the sense that the universe truly is indifferent, is a conflict that many people carry often from very early in life, sometimes even from a few weeks after conception. That horrific sense of existential isolation, of being uncontained, unprotected, unsupported by anything larger than random chance, that is ground from which every biological conflict springs. And that's why the atheist says, look at the baby with cancer. There obviously is no God. While GNM, misunderstood, says, look at the victim of life events who was shocked and developed a special biological program that they didn't dare resolve because that might do them in. But because I understand the fifth biological law, I don't see the baby with cancer as evidence that God is non-existent at best and super cruel if God does exist. The baby with a cancer diagnosis and undergoing various kinds of medical treatments is evidence that our civilization's foundational myth of existential isolation has been successfully installed within that child's family and probably within the child itself. But the cancer or symptom itself is not evidence, to me, of a cruel God or an indifferent universe. It's evidence that the child is at the leading edge of a new evolutionary potential. It's proof of the biological laws, and especially the fifth biological law, which is the quintessence of the Germanische Heilkunde. This child has taken on its life purpose with gusto and very early on. So what do we do with this? I don't want to leave you with the idea that our civilization is broken, what's the point? Nor do I want to platitudinize you that we should all just trust the universe and everything's going to be great. The 5 biological laws actually give us something much more specific and more useful that we can make use of when we're suffering because of the unjust suffering that we see in the world. The Germanische Heilkunde gives us a way to look at suffering, any suffering, even the most heartbreaking suffering, and ask, what is this a response to? What reality is this individual resisting within his or her psyche? What evolution would this individual achieve if he or she resolved the biological conflict and completed this special biological program? That question doesn't require that you agree with me about God. It doesn't require any particular spiritual framework. It just requires a willingness to look honestly at experience rather than writing it off as random misfortune or labeling it as punishment. That honest look is the beginning of genuine healing, not because looking at things honestly makes them go away. It doesn't, or at least not directly or immediately. But because the alternative of resisting reality, resisting what we don't like, trying to run away from suffering, which is coming from that existential isolation of believing your suffering is meaningless, that perpetuates the very condition that the special biological program is trying to resolve and help you to evolve through. I want to address the obvious objection to what I'm saying, which is really where the rubber meets the road for you and I to understand the biology of unjust suffering. I am not blaming the victim. Germanic New Medicine is not blaming the victim. The only ones who are blaming the victim are those who are playing the victim drama themselves. Unfortunately, that's the basis of the medical system and pretty much the entire health industry, as well as our entire 21st century dominant paradigm at the moment. What I'm saying is, the reason for unjust suffering is because of the idea that suffering is meaningless and purposeless, and so we should never ever have to suffer for any reason, and life should just be a gentle coast from sperm and egg all the way through to a nice euthanasia at the appropriate time, without having to lift a finger at any point along the way if we don't want to. Doesn't saying that suffering follows laws of nature because of what the individual is doing within their own psyche put the responsibility for suffering on the individual who's suffering? Doesn't that make it their fault? No, it really doesn't. Blame says you did something wrong and now you're being punished. Responsibility says this is happening in your experience and you have a relationship with it, and understanding that relationship is your path forward. Blame is a verdict. Responsibility is an offer or an invitation. When I say that we make a biological conflict within our psyche, I'm not saying the individual chose to be sick or deserved to be sick or could simply have thought their way out of it. I'm saying that there's a connection between what's happening in the individual's biology and what is alive in that individual, what life that individual is driven to live. This isn't some woo-woo metaphysical doctrine here. This is what's going on in every individual who makes a special biological program, whether they're an adult human, a baby, a beluga whale, a lizard, a fish, or a bug. And the special biological program is not punishment. It's information. And information, unlike punishment, can be worked with. This is explained better by a message from the Hopi people, a teaching sometimes called the Elder's Message. Part of it goes like this. There's a river flowing now very fast. It's so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid. They will try to hold on to the shore. They'll feel that they're being torn apart and they'll suffer greatly. Know that the river has its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above the water. That's what we're meant to do with suffering. We're not meant to fight the current. We're not meant to bemoan the suffering, turn into its victims, and conclude that the river is evil. We are meant to realize, oh, I'm suffering because I'm fighting this. And then we're meant to let go of the shore and trust that the river has a destination. When a baby gets cancer, it's because the baby has let go of the shore and let the river take them to their destination. Now it's your turn to put your attention on your own suffering and see how you are resisting what your consciousness wants for you. This has been Mind Over Symptom with Lishui Springford, where symptoms are not the enemy and you are your own authority. For more, visit mindtreehealth.co.